Welcome back. This is our final session of the summit, How to Address Race in the Classroom and Advance Racial Justice in Education. Moderating is Cat Shieh, Anti-Hate Training Coordinator. I'm sure she's been very busy in that role at the Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Chicago. Cat, it is all yours.
I just want to say thank you all so much for being here in our closing session, and also just want to thank again the Asia Society for bringing so many different kinds of folks together. We have a wonderful panel here today. I am so excited for us to close out with these three folks. And I think that they really bring in a diverse set of experiences that I think will really create just such a fruitful conversation. I'm just going to start out with our introductions with Stewart. Stewart, pronouns he, him, his. Just want to give the brag bio, as I oftentimes like to call it. Stewart is the co-founder and co-executive director of the Asian American Education Project and the project executive of the PBS Asian Americans docuseries. And that's definitely something that we're going to be talking about a little bit today. He's also the president emeritus, founder, president, and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles, one of the 5 affiliates that we are a part of, the nation's largest Asian American and legal civil rights organization. Kwoh is also a nationally recognized leader and expert in race relations, Asian American studies, nonprofits, civil rights, legal services. He was actually the first Asian American attorney and human rights activist to receive the MacArthur Genius Grant. He hails from UCLA, both his undergrad and his law degree. As a USC grad, I will be okay with that. And he also, just since we are here to talk about race and education, he's been teaching at the law school for over 35 years. So he's been doing this stuff in his sleep longer than some of us have been alive, and we are really excited to have him here today. Next we have is Kate Lee, she, her, hers. Kate is the program manager of the Asian American Education Project, as mentioned, that Stewart is a part of. Kate co-organized the campaign to include Asian American and Pacific Islander studies in the K-8 model curriculum for the whole state of Connecticut, and also serves on the board of directors for the Immigrant History Initiative. In addition to having 10 years of various teaching experiences, she was also the curriculum editor for the PBS Asian Americans docuseries. And as something that you'll probably learn a little bit about today, there were many people who were a part of that work. So I just want to thank you all for that. And in terms of an education background, Kate has a master's from Middlebury and a bachelor's from UC Davis. And last but not least, we have, would you prefer Chris or Christian?
Christian is fine.
Beautiful. So Christian, she and they are the KINETIC and youth organizer at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago. So what that actually means is that Christian is able to create and run leadership and organizing programs for immigrant and refugee high school students in Chicago public schools. So our youth knows what it means to actually be equipped with the tools to create change in their communities. Christian has just such an array of different for-profit as well as nonprofit experiences, as well as facilitation practice, curriculum design. So this is definitely the kind of stuff that's up her alley. Chris is also the founder of Luya Poetry, which is a awesome organization. I have been able to attend an event myself. And they are a local organization that uses poetry to bring together communities of color, build solidarity around issues, and reclaim our cultures and histories. Chris received their BA in political science and French from Ohio State. So as you can hear, we have a wide array of different experiences. And I just want to start out with the very first question for each one of us. And we'll go down the line in which I had introduced you all, if that's all right. And the first question is, how did you get into this work? And when I'm talking about getting into this work, I'm talking specifically about the work to integrate Asian American history in schools. How did you get into this?
Well, I was the president of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles, but I also taught a course called Asians in the Law at UCLA for 35 years. And about 15 years ago, I co-wrote a book called Untold Civil Rights Stories, Asian Americans Speak Out for Justice. And in that, I was trying to tell the stories about Asian Americans and the milestones that we've gone through. And then my wife gathered 4 teachers and we wrote 12 lesson plans. Then about 7 years ago, PBS came to see me to get support for their documentary, and I helped them raise maybe $2.5 million out of their $5.5 million budget. And then they saw my book, and then they said, could you also be in charge of the curriculum for our series? So my wife and I, at a moment of weakness, said yes. So my wife gathered 40 great teachers from around the country, including Kate, and they developed 36 lesson plans at the end of last year. And then we wrote a lesson plan on the current wave of hate, 3 lesson plans called Stand Against Hatred. So we had 51 lesson plans to get out to the public. And I spun off the Asian American Education Project to focus on this because, as people know, there have been about 6,000 incidents of hate against Asian Americans in the last year. And the stereotyping of Asian Americans is very deep. Like some students, even now, don't want to talk to Asian Americans because they think we're carrying the coronavirus. So when you have stereotypes and you don't have real education, the stereotypes rule. And so what we found in the schools, and I could go into this later, is that Asian Americans are invisible in the schools. Cat taught in the schools, we're just invisible. There's no, even in Los Angeles, there's no Asian American ethnic studies. We're part of a survey course. We have 4 weeks, plus Blacks and Latinx and Native Americans, but there's no lesson plans. It's just a series of questions. So it really bothered me that we were so invisible. And that's how I got into it, even though I had a background in this work. Really bothered me that we were invisible.
Thank you very much for that. Even just hearing from your answer of how much your years of teaching has really culminated into being able to translate this into the K-12 system, and then realizing how much is missing, right? And how much we really render people as if they don't exist, especially for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community is really dire, right? Stewart, I think you were totally right. Like I myself, for those of you who may not know, I was one of the pilot ethnic studies teachers in Los Angeles Unified. And knowing that, lesson plans are not existing, mentors are not existing, and Asian Americans most likely to get bullied, least likely to report, definitely under-enrolled as special ed folks, and so they don't get services. But anyways, I get off my soapbox. I'd love to hear from Kate. How did you get into this work?
So much of this echoes what Stewart says. As from my K-12 journey, I was a product of both public schools, private schools, and homeschool for a brief 2 years. And it wasn't until 2008, where it was my freshman fall of undergrad at UC Davis, I enrolled in my first Asian American Studies class. And in learning about the role Asian Americans had had in America, that it blew my mind. And it honestly, I continued to. I spent my entire 20s and continued to be on that journey of unpacking my identity and understanding exactly what I have to relearn. I think there's a big part of me when I look back in my middle school and high school years, especially seeing how deeply I unintentionally assimilated into my environment, and hoping to provide some sort of resource for future or current Asian Americans in those younger generations, for them to thrive earlier and to build self-confidence at an earlier age. And I think this is where about 2 years ago, I met Pat and Stewart. And when I learned of the PBS Asian Americans docuseries, I just wanted to do whatever I could to be a part of it and help increase our visibility and maybe not have our kids feel so invisible. Simultaneously, as I was working on the curriculum, I helped co-organize the campaign in Connecticut to see if we could integrate Asian American and Pacific Islander studies in whatever capacity we could. And so I'm glad to share that Connecticut has passed that, and that we're still continuing to work with other states such as Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Florida to get similar things going.
Crossing fingers for sure. Christian.
Well, the way I got into this work, specifically around getting Asian American history taught in schools in Illinois, is through working at Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Being the youth organizer, I felt very strongly that if we were going to try to pass law and policy that directly impact students, they need to have a seat at the decision-making table, right? And because they had that seat at our decision-making table, we were able to do so much with the Teach campaign. We were able to reach such a wide audience and really get some emotional and vulnerable testimonies from community members to help not only like build a narrative around why we need this kind of legislation, but also to help people just understand, the bill beyond just, kind of the dry policy wonkness of it all, right? Because something like this has a lasting long-term impact on people's, emotional health and psyche, right? It is widely known that Asian American students are bullied, right, for their race and culture, and are likely to underreport it. I think, when we pass legislation like this, it's really important to put it into terms that people understand its like true impact. And I guess on a more personal level, I, as Kat mentioned, I went to Ohio State University, which is a predominantly white institution. And the demographics of the university reflect the demographics of the state of Ohio. So it's, less than 1% Asian at the time that I went to Ohio State. And I very much felt invisible on my school campus. And in my quest to kind of find out why that was, that's when I learned about racial equity. That's when I learned about a lot of the history of this country that goes untaught, both at the high school level and the collegiate level. And I got involved with Asian Americans Advancing Justice even before I started working here as just a volunteer, because I knew that it was important for us to be doing community work, right, and to be working towards making the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois, and hopefully the whole of this country, right, a more equitable place for people of color, and to really, take a stance that Asian Americans are not going to be a wedge against other immigrant communities and other communities of color. And so when I think about, this work, because it doesn't just stop at getting legislation passed, you also have to make sure it's implemented in our classrooms. And there's so many moving parts to making sure that gets done. And so I look at passing the Teach Act in Illinois and also all the other work we do as essential steps in getting to the point where we have anti-racist classrooms, right? And we have Asian American history as just a given in the regular history that's taught.
Thank you for that, Chris. And I appreciate that you talked about it in both a really personal way, but also saying like the systems around us and how they continue to have white supremacy and racism, really bleed into everything that we do. Just starting with you, just wanted to ask, since you were directly, with Teach, making sure that there were students and youth at the decision-making table. What advice do you have for folks in other states? And I just really want to couch this in the idea that like, as much as Kate has been a part of like really passing legislation in other states and working with other states, as you have been a part of this work to make sure that the Teach Act is going to be passed and implemented, is passed and implemented well in the state of Illinois. We also know that there's 27 states and counting creating anti-critical race theory laws that, banning ethnic studies goes as far back as 2009. Some historians even argue the Gilded Age. What do we do in other states?
Okay, I will try to keep this brief because I feel like I can't encompass like an entire campaign strategy plan in this panel.
Actually, if you could have a plan for all 50 states and the 16 territories, I'm kidding.
I got you. If everyone could stay for the next 3 hours, we'll just do an entire power analysis. No, I'm kidding. I think something to remember, right? When we pass these laws, when we try to make things happen in our communities, I think it's easy, especially as educators, as someone who was also a former educator, right, to think that, okay, like as long as I get my lesson plans together and I I'm really like passionate about teaching this curriculum, it'll happen. And I think it's unfair to put the burden on all teachers when this is a structural issue that needs to be tackled like a structural issue. And I think something that was really strong about the way we were able to build this Teach campaign, which took, it took over a year to get it passed in Illinois, and it will be, another year of making sure implementation goes smoothly for when the mandate goes into effect in 2022. But it went well because we have built a lot of power in the city of Chicago and beyond to support the passing of a bill like this, right? So we have relationships that are strong with our state senators and state representatives, right, to get co-sponsors on the bill that we were trying to pass. We also have a really, really strong community infrastructure to support this bill, right? Because it's not just on our state senators and our state reps to whip votes for the bill. It's also on us to make sure that constituents are calling all of their colleagues, emailing them, texting people to get them, to actually do what they've promised and represent the people in their district and vote on legislation that their people are asking for. So just to give you some quick numbers, I pulled some up while you were talking, right? We sent over 15,000 text messages to community members to make them aware of petitions and email actions to support Teach, right, over the course of the campaign. We sent almost 900 emails to legislators, right, to get this on their radar. And we got over 1,000 witness slips in support of HB 376, which is the Teach Act. And that is unheard of, right? And we did that because our organization and all the organizations that we've partnered with to get Teach passed have spent a lot of time investing in a community base to build enough power to get this passed. And so I would say for other states, right, I think we have to really put time into community organizing. We need to invest in the leadership development of Asian Americans across all generations, right, across all class backgrounds and across citizenship backgrounds as well. And I think we have to build that infrastructure to get a bill like this passed, right? This wasn't just something that we came up with and just like pushed through. This was something that came from community. And I think that's why, we were able to get it passed in the House with a 98-13 vote and passed in the Senate with no opposition at all.
Thank you so much for that. And I also really appreciate how much you're talking about this in an Illinois specific, sort of case study, because we also know that the politics in every state is a lot for us to really be able to sort of think about and calculate and power map and whatnot. So really appreciate all the on the ground work that you and your team have been able to do. I also think that, what you're talking about, Christian, is really building in sort of that nuance of the complexities of just because you're able to get a governor to sign something doesn't mean that that's done and that's it. So I actually wanted to ask you, Stewart, I know that in our prep call, you did mention that policy is oftentimes, sort of like the first of the 10 steps taken in order to build that structural change. And I think Christian was talking about that a little bit. And I also want to acknowledge at the same time that we can't simply educate our way out of racism and white supremacy. So my question to you then becomes like, between the policy assigned and the teachers are now teaching AAPI history in classrooms, what steps in between do we also need to think about that we're not really talking about right now?
Well, I think that the overall strategy, our overall goal is to reach 1 million American students in the next few years of all different backgrounds across the United States. And as my wife was saying today in a conference call, that's just the beginning, because Asian American history is American history. And if you don't have it, you lose big chunks of American history. But I have gotten into this in the last few years, and I'm convinced you have to work top down, but you also have to work bottom up. As Christian said, if you don't implement, a policy could be not very useful. What are those 10 steps? You have to eventually convince individual schools that they should teach this course in a good depth. So you have to convince local schools, local principals, groups of teachers, and students that they need clear lesson plans and not just a series of questions. So you have to have those steps. Then you have to train the teachers, because the vast majority of teachers don't know how to teach ethnic studies, and especially Asian American ethnic studies. If you talked about some of the milestones like Vincent Chin, even the incarceration of Japanese Americans, if you talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act, even those milestones, most teachers don't know about. If you ask teachers, what was the Page Act that barred Asian women from coming to marry or to be join their husbands in the United States in the 1880s? Nobody knows what the Page Act was. So, if you don't train the teachers, you'll end up with a series of questions, and they won't teach the real lessons. There's a lot of lessons on the intersectionality between Blacks and Asians, starting from Frederick Douglass in 1869. The people know somewhat about the farm workers' strike in the 1900s and 1965, but the teachers don't know that actually was started by Filipino farm workers who united with the Mexican American farm workers. People don't know that history. So you have to train the teachers on these actual milestones, on the actual lesson plans. Then you have to encourage the teachers to teach, especially given the waves of anti-ethnic studies that is sweeping some of especially the red states. You have to fight that. You have to fight that tooth and nail. And we don't want to get into extraneous fights. What we want to fight about is the facts about Asian American history. They should speak for themselves, and people should learn that history. So let me give one last example. This does not require the organizers to be Asian Americans. It's nice if they are, but my favorite story is I called Inglewood just last month, and I knew a board member who knew a board member, and then I got referred to the district. And eventually I got to a Black woman who said, in Inglewood, we only have 1% Asian students. But she said, but because of the anti-Asian violence, I think we want to bring your resources into our schools. So she has already set up trainings for all the K-8 teachers and all the history teachers in September. So we're going to train them and encourage them to teach these lessons in their classroom. To me, that's what we want. We need people to help us be champions in their school. I'll repeat this at the end of the session, but there's a lot of you who are parents. You could really join this crusade right now by helping us to figure out how to get into your school. I have people who have children who are 8 years old. I have people who are, they have children who are in middle school. They're fighting to get us into the schools right now. So, the policy work that Advancing Justice Chicago did is very admirable. Actually, we're planning to train the Illinois teachers through our program. And so we're partners, but they will need the champions in the local schools. And that's why I plead for the Asia Society to step up, and individuals can fight for their children because their children and their classmates need to know about Asian American history. It is American history. And right now, believe me, we are invisible. Even in Los Angeles, we are invisible. So help us change that situation.
I love that you turn that question into really a call to action right at the very start. So thank you for that, Stewart. Fun fact, I actually taught about Stewart in my classroom when I taught ethnic studies through the Vincent Chin film. So it's kind of cool to see how things come full circle. You know, I just want to say, I think, Stewart, you know, what you were talking about were some of the challenges, right? And I know that you definitely talked about teachers, but you were also sort of, implying about like how our school systems can really build in some challenges, you know, and, you know, just to make sure that I, as a moderator, want to be like affirming to this, you know, as mentioned, like ethnic studies, you know, isn't really a thing in a lot of places. Part of the reason why I myself am not a teacher is because I cannot in the state of Illinois. Ethnic studies is either not taught or banned in 3/4 of this country. And then we wonder why like teachers don't necessarily always feel equipped to be able to know or talk about things like the PAGE Act. Of the 5,000 higher ed institutions, including community college, of the 5,000 or so higher ed institutions, about 370 of them have ethnic studies departments. Otherwise, they will deny tenure of professors and just rotate professors and have a visiting Asian American studies professor at best, right? In places even as prestigious as Northwestern. I know that Harvard just rejected ethnic studies, I think their 4th time, right? Like we are in an uphill battle. So when Stewart is talking about this, that is definitely the case, you know, and with all these challenges and just being very frank about that, Kate, this is where you come in. Let's just be like really clear about this. From the things that you've noticed so far, of your extensive teaching experience as well, what challenges do you notice in regards to schools wanting to address race in the classroom?
It's a loaded question. I'm going to do my best in the limited time we have. It depends. Some schools don't want to, right, at all. And you can be, at the end of the day, the teachers are in their classrooms and they interact with the students. And these students come from a huge range, and we don't know what they're being raised with in terms of background knowledge. We don't know what they're hearing at the dinner table or at home. We also don't know how parents are going to react. And so I think, especially in the last few years, some teachers have felt scared to talk about race in the classroom because you don't know what the backlash is going to be like. You don't know if teachers, if your colleagues, if your supervisors, if parents are going to make a fuss about it. And this is where you, as teachers, it's really on us to be brave and use our voices. And this is where Stewart's call to action, it's not just for parents, it's for anyone who's interested in this. You know, we as a community might not be used to being super loud about what we believe in. And this is where I think we have power in numbers, and to find your allies, find people who can create a good sounding board for you all as you continue to figure out how to make change at a school level or even just within the classroom. I think now that there's a lot of resources out there, teachers also fear not knowing how to scaffold it properly in terms of, and Christian, you brought this up in the chat about how teachers and educators deserve to feel supported in the content they're teaching and feel safe to bring those concepts into the classrooms. And this is where social emotional learning plays such a huge role, especially in the younger grades too, in formatting how students start to think about themselves in a positive light to build their confidence from a very early age. And I think, not saying this is the one solution that's going to fit all issues, but this is where framing it as coming in from being kind, utilizing empathy, seeing stories from other people's point of views. I think that really helps a lot. And I think in terms of having tough conversations with parents or supervisors, when you couch it back and anchor it in kindness, it's really hard for someone to come back and say, like, I don't believe in that. And at the end of the day, every student, no matter what their race or background is, just wants to be seen, heard, recognized, valued, loved. And that is our that's what we look to as teachers, to make sure we provide that space for them. And yeah, there's, again, we could talk about this for hours, but in terms of a quick bit.
Yeah. Totally. Thanks for that. I appreciate how frank you were, just in terms of like the uphill battle. Everything you said and how you've personally felt, these are all things I have felt too. And just to be transparent, I have needed to sign NDAs from schools that I've fired from LA Unified. Like this is a lot, for a lot of us to think about. And I think when you're talking about building those coalitions and those allies and whatnot is definitely a great concrete step for us to think about. I do want to just acknowledge that there is some questions in the Q&A. The participants and attendees, you're more than welcome to add any in the Q&A. I will address them in the last 15 minutes of this panel. So thank you for that. Kate, I do have a follow-up for you. So if you're talking about, students wanting to be seen, and I just want to make this really clear. We have Asian Americans in all 50 states. We have them in all 16 of our territories. And we are the fastest growing minority group. And some of these factoids we already know. But we're still relatively small in numbers. So what do you say to somebody who says, we don't have Asian American students to teach this to? Right. And when I say this, I'm not only talking about teachers, I'm talking about school administrators who've also said this. That there are district employees that have said this. Kate, help me. What do I say?
This goes back to what Stewart was saying, that Asian American history is American history. To know that the first steps we took, our Chinese American folks took, was to literally help build the infrastructure onto which Americans then became successful and became a force in the world. We literally contributed to that first increase in technological advancement in this country. And so this is where it's ownership, putting the onus on others to learn the true history and to get their facts straight. I think this is also where you got to understand that I think anyone who's seen the news has seen the uptick in anti-Asian hate. And this is where it's not on just us as a community to protect our brothers and sisters. This is on everybody to look out for each other. And I think this is where, especially in K-12 schools, we use, upstander and upstander versus bystander training, and this is learning that history. That's a step in many. And that it's not a conversation I want to have whenever someone comes in with this, I'm not Asian, this doesn't matter. Buddy, it matters. It matters a lot, because we all have to learn and unlearn and relearn history. And I don't think that ever ends. I think in decades from now, some change will have occurred, definitely. But I still think we're going to be thirsting for more historical context as to all the untold stories out there, because I'm sure there's a lot.
Even as you talk about these untold stories and how it is a lifelong commitment to relearn, unlearn history and how it's taught, I couldn't help but really reflect on the fact that Stewart, your class, Asians in Law, how many folks, that was their very first time taking an Asian American anything. Right? Why do we have to be 27 years old? Why do we have to be 23 years old? Why do we have to be 36 years old to ever really acknowledge the fact that we exist as people, right? I couldn't help but always, I can't help but always think about that, right? How old do we have to be to acknowledge that there are people who are not, who actually exist on this earth? With what you're saying, I want to make sure that we're thinking about sort of this implementation, that we have the words to be able to defend this. Christian, I know that you're very passionate about this. I want to ask you, oftentimes when we do have Asian American history actually taught in classrooms, when we have seminars on this, it's oftentimes very East Asian American heavy. We talk about Japanese Americans, we'll talk about the railroads, we'll talk about Chinese Americans. And I can't help but just really want to just call out that sort of hegemony, right? And the power dynamics of when we are only talking about certain Asians as Asian American history. So do you have any tips for teachers, administrators, school leaders alike to ensure that Asian American history curriculum is truly inclusive, includes South Asians and Middle Eastern and North African folks and Southeast Asian and Pacific Islanders? And then Christian, once you answer Stewart, I'd love to have like a piece of advice from you on this question as well.
I think part of the answer to your question lies in the question itself, right? In honestly being aware, right? That Asia covers such a broad swath of this earth, right? It's just facts. And that there are multiple languages, multiple ethnic groups, multiple cultures, traditions, etc., baked into that. And understanding that we have to teach all of it. I think that there's some really good just Asian American and immigrant history timelines out there that I think can be a good jumping point for people to see, right, a trajectory and choose things. I would also say that I think looking at local and regional examples is really important. I think like if you're speaking as someone who is in the Midwest right now, if you look at migration history of not just Illinois, but also the states around us, there's an incredible wealth of Southeast Asian stories and South Asian stories that can be told, right? And so we don't have to just focus on, what is perhaps coming out of like the coastal areas of the country, right? When you're teaching Asian American history in your classrooms, I highly encourage people to draw from local examples. When they are there, they might be a little bit harder to find, right? You might have to do some digging. I would also say, reaching out to community. And I think that teaching Asian American history gives you such a wonderful opportunity to bring the community into your classroom, right? Reaching out to local organizations are often fantastic stewards of cultural and migration history of the area. I know not every state is the same with resources, but like, for example, in Illinois, we have, Japanese American associations, we have Cambodian American associations, we have Vietnamese American associations, where you can actually bring in folks, right? If you don't know all of that content yourself, because it, as like Kate has already alluded to, right? If you're not being trained on it when you are becoming a teacher, right? How are you supposed to know? So that is some advice I would give. And also just understanding that like Asian American history, I think, is such a fantastic way to also teach about civics in this country, the political history of this country, right? Asian American history is immigrant history, is POC history, right? The way that you can talk about different communities of color within that, the way you can talk about art, culture, literature within Asian American history, right? It presents you with such an array of choices. So I think there's really no excuse to leave out certain populations when you can draw from so much to teach about, Asian American communities that are less visible in the grand scheme of things.
Thank you for that. Stewart?
Yes, we are very committed to developing new lesson plans on Pacific Islanders, South Asians. We have an elementary school caucus that wants us to develop more elementary school lessons. So we're doing that. We actually are working with a group called Launch to develop a comic book series. So we already have a Marvel DC comic book writer who's developing a 40-page comic book for 5th, 6th, and 7th graders. So we are trying different approaches to get to the students, because we feel things need to be approached in a novel way, in an attractive way, in a way that gets people's attention. I would tell one story that we were celebrating after Martin Luther King was declared a national holiday, and we had a press conference. And a young Chinese reporter came up to me, or in the press conference said, "Why should we care about this? What difference does it make?" And I wasn't offended, but I was curious. I said, "When did you come over to the United States? When did your family come over?" And he said, "Oh, after 1970. And I said to him, "But for the civil rights movement, you wouldn't be here today." And so, a lot of our population doesn't know Asian American history. our population in 1970 was 1 to 2 million people. Today it's 23 million people. So a lot of our Asian Americans, yes, there are very deep historical roots, especially since we were excluded from coming to the country. There are very deep milestones and cases, but the large part of the population are newcomers. So they have to be taught themselves what happened, what shaped their coming to the country. And it's incumbent on us as Asian Americans to bring that history alive, to explain why this is such a crucial part of American history, because in their backgrounds, they don't have that background. They don't have it. They have a background from a foreign country, but they don't have the historical sense of what happened in the United States. I think Asia Society is a perfect organization to correct that historical gap, but it exists partly to correct that historical gap, because if you don't, most people think, oh, well, let's just start again from the 1970s, and that's okay. That's not okay, because people, when they look at the current wave of anti-Asian hate, if they say, has this happened before? It has happened before. But if you don't know the history, you won't know that. So we have to draw on our history to learn the examples, to learn the lessons, and that'll make us all a stronger people and a stronger community.
Thank you so much for that, Stewart. Even as you're talking about, like, when do we introduce, a community or group of people, I couldn't help but just think about the fact that, it's not that our stories aren't just like missing. They're like deliberately silenced and not told, right? It's not that we didn't exist. We are taught that people don't exist. And that's always sort of like the fallacies that we have to, kind of like what Kate was saying, right? Like relearning and unlearning that history. In the interest of time, I would love you all to just give me a very quick 30-second sort of spiel on my next question before I open it up to Q&A. And it looks like we're already getting a queue here. So you get 20 seconds to answer this last question. You've already kind of noticed, there are many difficulties when it comes to making sure race is taught in classrooms. Many folks don't actually know that a lot of these concerns are centered around teacher burnout and teacher protections. And that's something that we kind of talked about a little bit. This is actually like studied if you need sort of this to put in your back pocket. The scholar Tracy Buenavista actually coined the term forced disappearance, as an issue for K-12 teachers, how much we're pushed out of the classroom, how much there is emotional burnout or emotional trauma that comes from the students because we are trusted, how much there is really emotional burnout of like, oh my God, I didn't add enough cultures of like Asian and Asian Americans. It's a lot. It's a lot to handle from my own personal experience, from the experience of so many others. What advice do you have for people moving forward to address this concern? And remember, you got like 20 seconds to think about how you want to solve the burnout of all teachers.
I'll jump in. I know that there are community members in this conference, so I want to talk to you as a fellow community member, as a community organizer. You have a role in our classrooms too. You have a role in the education that the children of your communities are experiencing, right? You have a role to play in your neighborhood schools. And I would say, make yourself heard, make yourself loud, right? Admin may not always listen to teachers, school boards may not always listen to teachers, but if there are parents, community members, students themselves, right, supporting the same things that their teachers are advocating for, they cannot ignore you. And I want everyone in here to know that collectively we have so much power. And as some of our panelists were alluding to, our history is not invisible for just by accident, right? It is on purpose. We are being erased. We are being invisibilized on purpose. And if we want to combat that, we have to understand that we do have power and we can make choices to collectively come together and support this work.
Thank you. Kate?
Such a great question, and I appreciate you asking that. Speaking as a teacher, I think what's really important is when we tackle things of ethnic studies or anything DEI related, we have to treat it as a team marathon. And it is impossible for any one person to be on 24/7 for the entire thing. And you have to remember to pass the baton. And more importantly, you have to remember to be able to say no when you're tapped out, because emotional labor is something really real when we are talking about a lot of this. And you have to protect yourself from burnout. And also helps to remember that emotional labor is not compensated as a teacher. I think that's something worth remembering. So remember, in order to do the best you can for your students and your community, you have to put yourself first. And just remember to give yourself permission to take breaks.
I feel like Kate just gave unions across the country some advice that emotional labor should now be compensated hourly and X time. Have your local school site council pass that. And Stewart, your 20 seconds of advice.
Well, I would say team up with teachers, because a lot of teachers feel isolated and they're pushing for the history, but they feel isolated. They feel alone. Team up, because as I said before, parents, students can make a difference if they speak up and they say they want this taught in the classroom, and they're willing to partner with the teachers to make it happen. We have talked to a lot of teachers who feel alone, but if we team up, and student groups have called us, parent groups have called us, let's team up and let's get this done, because to get to the 1 million students, we have to have a team. We can't do it as one organization or even 10 organizations. We have to have hundreds of groups really organizing and pushing this in this period of time. One last thing I would say is that Asian Americans are getting more attention right now because of the severity and the number of hate incidents. But guess what? You don't know how long it will last. You don't know if it will last 3 months or 3 years. So let's seize the moment right now and push as hard as we can, because we don't know if if the response from schools in a few years is that, oh, well, we don't have Asian students, so we don't need to teach it. Or we haven't heard anything from any parents or any students, so we don't feel we have to teach it. Let's get lazy again. I just think we have to push like crazy. And we would love to team up with the Asia Society and everybody in this conference today.
Thank you for that, Stewart. I am going to go over into the Q&A. Thank you for that advice and just for acknowledging, really the difficulties within our school systems and within, our societal culture to get all this done. Kate, I'm going to hand the baton to you really quickly. It looks like we had a question that I know you really wanted to address from this. This is a person, they are like ready and willing. They're organizing a unit on Asian Am history. It's going to happen, like it or not. Like, what understandings or takeaways you think students should come away with? And then resources. What's like the first 2 steps you're going to give them and say, like, you're going to start now? Kate?
I'm so excited about this. First and foremost, I also hope whatever you're doing, also share with your history department just to get more people on board as well. It's tough to say. There's a lot, without knowing the details of your unit structure, I would lead you straight to resources. I'd welcome you to check out asianamericanedu.org and just see what's there. We have everything split into 5 separate themes. One of our more popular ones is Stand Against Hatred, and that provides a collection of lesson plans specifically towards helping folks feel empowered in situations. Thank you for the link in the chat. This is where taking a beat to also recognize what the format of your classroom is like. Do all the students feel comfortable speaking up, and what can you do to help that? Take a beat just to be able to anticipate what roadblocks might be ahead. But just the fact that you're having this unit is a really big deal. And I encourage you to spread the word between your network as well, because we just need more teachers like yourself to take that on with or without policy in place.
If I can pretend to be a panelist right now, I used to be an international baccalaureate history teacher. I know that there are definitely like two ways that you can sort of also like think about history. The first one is an events-based form of history teaching, which I actually think, Kate and Stewart have plenty of resources on this. It's part of the PBS Asian American curriculum, whereas like you actually look at timelines and you're able to come up with specific types of events to really define the Asian American experience. The other type of history teaching that many people do not necessarily know about is thematic based teaching. Right. So like having a theme on immigration, a theme on capitalism and exploitation, a theme on labor, a theme on gender and sexualization. It's a little bit harder. You got to be a little bit more creative, but sometimes it also helps build that sort of that solidarity of, oh, wow, like labor and class exploitation is not, to some degree, is a unique Asian American experience. And also to some degree, can we also really reach out and kind of go to that next step and be able to talk about how our experiences are so often shared with other community groups and folks of color too. The next question here is someone has mentioned that they taught a world cultures class. It does include Asian American communities, and students, and also this is from my own experience too, students are never really the issue of like the buy-ins. They do eventually come around. They know what you're talking about. It's really the community themselves, right? Like the parents that are not as open-minded. Maybe they want to, maybe like part of their own immigration story sometimes is based off of anti-Blackness or anti-Asianness or something. What do we do to educate parents to accept and learn about other cultures? And sometimes when we're talking about educating parents, maybe this sometimes means our own admin. So with that said, Stewart, can you help us out with this question?
Well, I think parents need to know the history too. Like I said, they need to know they wouldn't be here today, but for the civil rights movement. The vast majority of Asians wouldn't be here in the United States because the Exclusion Act and the remnants of the exclusion laws would still be with us. So they need to know that history. And in particular, they need to know the history in light of the current wave of anti-Asian violence, that this has happened before, how we have built alliances. I think that that's very important. I'm meeting with the head of the person who's in charge of ethnic studies at Berkeley in a couple of weeks on Asian American studies. So starting to spread to local areas. And I just think that people who are interested need to seize the moment to really push it. They need to talk to other parents to see how they could get it into the schools. They need to talk to the teachers. They need to talk to students who have organized. Again, this has to be a team effort. And I'm very confident that we can make some headway, but we have to seize the moment right now. And I don't think people should be shy. I can tell you about at least 10 parents have contacted us to try to get it into their kids' schools. There's student groups who are contacting us. I just think all of us need to team up and really work together to get this into the schools as soon as possible.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. And I just want to say, Stewart, I think your continued sense of urgency throughout this panel, at least for me, is really reminding me that like we can't wait, right? Just because August is about to roll in, I think it's really easy to sort of have that, start of school year energy, but really understanding that this has to be sustained throughout the school year. I know it's a huge ask, but I appreciate that reminder from you. Christian, I do want to ask you really quickly. This is a two-part question, so I'll just ask it like one after another. The first thing is, I think that you are particularly good at this. What norms do you recommend, or maybe behaviors and practices do you recommend in creating spaces for these conversations? And I know that in the question, it actually says safe spaces, but maybe we can talk about the difference between safe and brave too.
Yeah, I would love to answer this question, especially because of the work I do with high school students. I run a youth organizing program that is specifically for immigrant and refugee students, right? So when we discuss personal histories, family histories, right, we talk about some difficult things. And we also, I can never predict where each student is at in their own individual learning and political activation journey. So something that we always do is we create, guidelines together. Right? So not just me saying here are our guidelines for the classroom, but me with the students that I work with, asking them how do you want the space to be? I remember actually earlier this summer during our summer program, I asked them, very frankly, what are things that happen in your classroom that you dislike? I can't promise that I am going to combat all of them, but let's get that out so we can figure out how we want this space to be and how we want to conduct conversations here. And I think when you have them buy into that and agree with that, when you run into snags, right, when you're having a challenging conversation and maybe you have a student who is parroting something that they heard on the news or from a friend or from a parent that is going to derail the conversation, you can go back to those agreements that you worked with them on, right? If you are able to get your students committed to understanding they must respect each other in conversation, that they must make space for feeling and emotion, and that they have to be open to challenges, right, and not dehumanize each other, I think that really changes the tone of the conversations you're able to have. I also think it's really good practice too, if something difficult happens, right, because we are not all social workers and counselors, right? I am not, right? I'm an educator and I have taught in classrooms as well as more popular ed spaces, but it's understanding that our capacity only goes so far, but that sometimes we will make mistakes, but as the adult in charge, right, in the classroom, recognizing that power dynamic and checking in with students after something difficult might happen in a classroom, right? Don't just let them walk out when that's done, right? Ask them to stay back, ask them how they feel, even if you can't play the role of counselor in that moment. Sometimes a student just knowing that you cared enough to ask them, how did that exchange in our classroom affect you, does wonders for how they continue to show up in your classroom afterwards. And I think also being able to talk frankly to a student who may have expressed something that is negative or harmful in your classroom, and just to talk them through hey, I'm not in a way that doesn't make them feel like they were wrong, but just help them see hey, other people in our class felt upset about what you said. Let's talk about why that might be and how we can, show up in a different way moving forward.
Something that I noticed you say that I actually, quite honestly, did not necessarily see in classrooms enough. The community agreements are oftentimes democratized in classrooms. They are not held accountable after. Right. It becomes a 1 day or a 3 day activity, but not actually holding folks accountable to the agreements of you broke this agreement. You did this agreement. You should be praised for that. Right. That's when kids honestly realize that we're kind of full of crap. Right. Quite honestly. Right. It's hard to feel the spaces are safe and brave enough for us when we don't even hold our own moral compass, in front of students in a way that makes sense. Second part of the question, Christian, how do you think we can incorporate personal experiences into curriculum?
I think you can do this in different ways, right? You can bring in written accounts. You can actually bring in speakers to your classroom. What I was talking about with building community partnerships, I think that's a really effective way. And I would remind us, right? What are we taught when we are learning how to teach history. We talk about sources all the time. We talk about the importance of primary sources. Personal experience is a primary source, right? And can be a really fantastic way to have, deep conversations with your students because they're actually hearing somebody's lived experience, right? It's much more, colorful and rich for them to hear that than, maybe just sticking to a textbook. So I would just say, like, if you want to bring personal experience into the classroom, I do it, and if you need like a reminder that it's okay, like that's a primary source.
Awesome. Awesome. I'm really glad that you're also thinking about how we need to, going back to what Kay said, retraining and like unlearning and relearning things in history. Our primary source as personal experiences, I personally believe is part of countering anti-race or countering racism, right? Primary sources are oftentimes written and spoken about by educated, affluent people who were able to read and write in ways that are passed on beyond generations. And then we wonder why we don't have more diverse perspectives in history, right? Like, well, we've already created that sort of social hierarchy of what word is more important or less important than the other, right? So thank you for that, Christian. I think you're able to give a lot of really tangible advice for us. Stewart, I'd love to hear from you really quickly. There is a question, and this is going to be our last question before I have us go out into closing. Can you just very quickly talk about your perspective on integrating bilingual and multilingual education in addressing race and ethnicity in the classroom?
Well, I think that people should first of all, understand that the bilingual education stemmed from the Lau versus Nichols case in 1971, and so did ESL stem from the Lau versus Nichols case. So it's actually Asian Americans who started that. And I think that I've been talking to the Cal State system because I've been talking to the bilingual teachers to try to integrate our history into how they teach bilingual education. So I think there's a lot of avenues to intersect and to bring our history into the bilingual education space. But I think that, a little history about where it came from, how it's evolved is very important. I think that a lot of things can be tied into the curriculum, like the current bullying can be tied into the curriculum. Arts and culture can be tied into the curriculum. The bilingual education can be tied into the curriculum. So I think we have to bring these things together because there's not one route in each school. There might be multiple routes. And we need to explore all that because we need to build a team at the school. And we've been called into different schools to address these things. And like the bilingual teachers have called on us to try to figure out how to bring this into the bilingual education setting. Schools that are experiencing bullying of students and teachers have called us in. So I would just say, let's work together because time is short and we need to make some headway. In California, they were talking about an Asian American and an ethnic studies mandate. That ethnic studies mandate won't take effect until 2029. I mean, give me a break. So the districts have to take it on themselves. The schools have to take it on themselves to bring this into the schools in the next year or two. We can't wait until 2029. So I just think that this is the time to team up and to make some headway. And it's all for our students. It's all for the youth. It's all for the future of the country.
Thank you. And so if we're trying to better our schools and our country through your book, Untold Civil Rights Stories, where could I buy it if it's out of stock?
Yeah, my wife said in a meeting today, it's only online, but I will ask her to put it on to put the link on our website, asianamericanedu.org.
Beautiful.
We just printed a few thousand copies and we distributed all of them. And anyway, I'll tell her to get it online.
Thank you very much. Before I actually pass it on to Margaret, Christian, Kate, Stewart, thank you all so much for being a part of this panel. You have like 12 seconds to make your like last little closing remark. I'll start with Kate, then Stewart, and then Christian will close us out.
We got to team up, just like what Stewart says. If you want to find people like ourselves, reach out to us. I'll drop my email in the chat, but reach out. There's a lot of us out there. We just need to connect.
I will drop my email too. Stewart?
Let's get going. I spoke to somebody at the Department of Education recently, and he said, to go through all the politics is going to take too long. Here's the name of my kid's school. Let's get it started.
Thank you, Stewart. And then Christian.
Change comes from communities. It comes from grassroots organizing. I truly believe that in the bottom of my heart. It's the hill I will die on. I want y'all to know we did it in Illinois, right? We are a Midwestern state that is predominantly white. We did it here. You can do it in your state too. And I just want to leave everyone with that. You have power. People have power.
I hope all of you who are attending this, you are getting this sort of notion that you are not alone in this work. And there are people who are fighting and rooting for you every step of the way in this. So with that, thank you all so much for being on this panel and for your expertise, the hard-hitting questions from the attendees. And I will pass it over to Margaret.
Thank you, Kat, Stewart, Kate, and Christian. Stewart, we're going to be working hard on closing that historical gap at Asia Society. We would love to work more with all of you, and we've learned a lot from all of you today. So thank you very much.